When it was announced that the PS5 was going to be backwards compatible with PlayStation 4 games, there was hope that the next generation console would also be able to play more of Sony's backlog. Patents appeared indicating Sony was at least experimenting with some sort of emulation, and many rumours began to circulate implying that all PlayStation games would be playable on the PS5. Unfortunately, as we know, that was not the case, with the PS5 only supporting PS4 titles and a limited number of PlayStation 2 titles via backwards compatibility. The PlayStation 3 is a difficult console to emulate, mostly due to its cell CPU. Emulating the console requires an extremely powerful processor, which is why the PlayStation 4, with its extremely underpowered Jaguar CPU, was unable to even attempt some form of PS3 emulation. This time round, things are different. Featuring a third generation Ryzen Zen 2 processor, the PS5 has a very capable, modern CPU, on par with high-end gaming PCs, and is a massive improvement over the PS4 and the PS4 Pro's CPU. With this additional horsepower, and improvements in the PS3 emulation scene over the years, I set out to find out one thing. Could the PS5 emulate the PS3? Now, the PS5 cannot currently emulate the PlayStation 3. It has no emulator, and therefore it cannot run the games since the PS5 effectively does not know how to run the PS3 games. So I decided to try something different. Enter my streaming PC. Powered by next generation RGB lighting, my streaming PC has a very similar processor to the PlayStation 5. Featuring a second generation Ryzen Zen Plus CPU, it is older than the newer Gen 3 Zen 2 CPU the PS5 uses, but its performance should be within a similar range of performance to the PS5, perhaps slightly weaker. It does, however, give us the opportunity to see how emulating PlayStation 3 games would perform on Zen architecture, so I feel it would help make the test more accurate to how a PS5 may perform. Now, the rest of the specs are different, with the PS5 featuring a unified memory setup and a much more modern GPU, but the key focus when emulating games is in most cases the CPU, and we're close enough in that regard. We can easily bump the resolution up to 1080p and 4K, so the GPU and memory shouldn't be a limiting factor here. We're also going to be using the RPCS3 emulator for these tests. A fantastic emulator which has seen huge improvements over the years, with a large number of the PlayStation 3's library playable without any issues. For these tests, I decided to test Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, Resistance Fall of Man, Metal Gear Solid 4, LittleBigPlanet, and Demon's Souls, 5 PS3 console exclusives that are not currently playable anywhere else. Before we begin though, I'd like to point out that 2 of the games on this list, MGS4 and Ratchet & Clank, are not currently considered playable by the RPCS3 team, as they may have some glitches that prevent you completing the game. That said, we can still launch and play parts of the games, and given their popularity, I feel as though they should still be tested to show performance levels. Finally, from this point onwards, I'll be referring to the streaming PC as the PS5 PC. And with that out of the way, without further ado, let's begin. Ratchet & Clank is a series that I love, and Tools of Destruction was the first of a new future trilogy on the PlayStation 3 console. The game targets 60 frames per second at 720p on the PS3, and generally it meets that performance target pretty well, being one of the first games on the PS3 to do so. On our PS5 PC, we are able to match the 60 FPS target and even exceed it at 1080p, hitting highs of around 80 frames per second. However, this only occurred in more linear sections. When the levels open up, such as on the grind rail sections and when we first arrive at the spaceport on Kobalia, our 2700X is hit hard and performance drops below 60 frames per second and can reach as low as the mid-30s. Since the game speed is tied to the frame rate, Tools of Destruction will noticeably slow down when these frame drops occur. Given that the frame rate drops below 60 frames per second in open areas, it seems to suggest that the Ryzen CPU is not able to properly emulate everything happening on screen. We are essentially seeing a CPU limitation here. Now, depending on who you ask, the game may still be considered playable, but performance is still worse than running on native PS3 hardware, where the game holds close to its 60 frames per second target in most situations. Resistance Fall of Man was my favourite game on the PS3 at launch, and being a new IP from Insomniac, I thought it would be a good choice to see how it performed. On the PS3, the game runs at 720p and targets 30 frames per second. To my surprise, the PS5 PC was able to match the PS3 and hold 30 frames per second for most scenarios at 720p as well. So I decided to take things a step further and see how much headroom our Ryzen CPU had in terms of performance, and the results were surprising. Much like Tools of Destruction, Resistance was able to lock to 60 frames per second for extended periods of time in the more linear levels, and it felt great to play. However, once I got to the second mission, things changed. Again, like Tools of Destruction, it appears that more open areas tax the Ryzen CPU more heavily and are more difficult to emulate. With the 60 frames per second mod enabled, we see the frame rate drop from 60 to as low as the mid-20s, making for an unstable experience. I decided to use this as a stress test and went back to the same section with the original 30 frames per second cap. At 30 FPS, the drops to the mid-20s didn't feel as bad, since the drops aren't as sharp as 60 to the mid-20s, so I'd consider it to be a better experience with the 30 FPS cap due to consistency. There were a few other issues, like cutscenes playing at twice the speed at 60 frames per second, but overall, I'd say the performance of the game is similar to a PS3, so it is a pretty impressive showing for our PS5 PC. Metal Gear Solid 4 was the main reason why I bought a PS3, so I had to include it here too. Using a custom RPCS3 build, I was able to get the game running. On the PS3, Metal Gear Solid 4 runs at 1024x768, which is less than 720p. It also has an unlocked frame rate, which means it can go as low as the low 20s to as high as 60 frames per second in enclosed linear sections, but it appears to have a double buffer VSync enabled and tends to run at 30 FPS more on average. On our PS5 PC at 1080p, performance was a bit lower than the PS3. In the opening area, the frame rate is hovering around the low 20s pretty consistently, which appears to be lower than the PS3. I then decided to test this area here where a big battle between the PMCs and Rebels is taking place, and we can see almost immediately our Ryzen CPU is hit hard when emulating this section, holding a consistent 12 to 14 frames per second. The PS3 does not fare that much better, hitting around 20 frames per second on average, but this would still make for a better experience than the PS5 PC. While it is impressive that the PS5 PC can emulate MGS4, performance is not quite where it needs to be, and would imply that the PS5 may have some trouble emulating this game as well. But there are games that our PS5 PC could run pretty much flawlessly. LittleBigPlanet runs at 30 FPS at 720p on the PS3. On our PS5 PC, the game ran at a flawless, locked 30 frames per second at 1080p, providing a smooth, consistent experience and easily matching the PS3 in terms of performance whilst exceeding it in terms of image fidelity, and the game looks great. Given that the PS5 Zen 2 processor is probably more powerful than the Zen Plus CPU in our PS5 PC, it would imply that the PS5 would also have little difficulty emulating this title as well. Then there's Demon's Souls. With all the talk of the PS5 remake, bringing with it a lot more attention to the title, I thought it would be great to take a look at the original title in all of its glory. The original Demon's Souls runs at 720p with a 30 FPS target, though in more demanding scenes it can drop a fair bit lower than that. On our PS5 PC, we were able to easily lock to 30 FPS at 1080p with little difficulty. In fact, as a test, I decided to unlock the frame rate, allowing Demon's Souls to run at 60 frames per second, and to my surprise, it was pretty much a 60 FPS lock and has been the footage you've been seeing so far. In this case, our PS5 PC was able to double the frame rate and increase the resolution, meaning the PS5 should also be able to achieve similar results and making it a great way to revisit the classic. So, back to the question for this video. Could the PS5 emulate PS3 games? Well, I think the answer is, it depends. I know, I'm sorry, it's not a definitive answer. Clearly there are some titles that the PS5 has the horsepower to emulate, with Demon's Souls, LittleBigPlanet, and to a lesser extent Resistance Fall of Man, all performing incredibly well, and all titles had much faster loading and install times thanks to the SSD. But equally, other titles like Metal Gear Solid 4 and Ratchet & Clank show performance would not quite be where it needs to be, though it is worth mentioning again that both of these titles are not currently considered playable by the RPCS3 team, and the game's performance and emulation of these titles have come a long way over the years. There's also going to be some titles that just won't work, since there's some SPU functions that no CPU or PC can properly emulate at this time. Modern Vintage Gamer has a great video discussing why the PS3 is so difficult to emulate at length, which I've put a link to in the description below. Now, some of you may be thinking that an official Sony emulator may perform differently, and whilst that may be true, RPCS3 is already an extremely impressive emulator, improving consistently at almost a monthly rate. I'm confident that the performance seen while using RPCS3 on the PC could be seen as representative on how well the PS5 could emulate PS3 games. Despite some of the games having issues in this video, I deliberately chose them as they're both exclusive to the PS3 or not available on other platforms. It would have been easy for me to cherry pick one of the 1000 plus playable titles with near enough no issues, but I figured a range of the more commonly asked for exclusive titles would be more interesting to test. Finally, there's also the question, is it worth it to Sony to make an emulator for the PS5? Again, it depends. Based on these results, I think a curated list of PS3 titles could be made backwards compatible on the PS5, much like how Microsoft only makes Xbox and Xbox 360 titles playable if they pass their testing process. But more importantly for Sony, it could also help add value to the PS Now service, allowing PS5 owners to download and play some of their PS3 titles on the PS Now service to the PS5, much like how you can already do so with the PS4 and PS2 games. But ultimately, the issue is time and money. Microsoft has a large dedicated team of people working on their backwards compatibility program, rigorously testing each individual game before release. Given the difficulty in emulating the PS3, it is unlikely Sony would see it as a worthwhile financial investment, and I suspect they would double down on the streaming side of PS Now for PS3 games instead. Personally, I would love Sony to introduce some form of PS3 disc-based backwards compatibility, but sadly I do not think it is something we will see on the PS5. Perhaps at some point in the future Sony will expand their backwards compatibility program, but only time will tell. But that's all from me. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below if you want to discuss PS3 emulation further, and subscribe to the channel for more. If live streaming is your thing, consider following me on Twitch. Thanks again, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye for now.